Intersectionality has, of course, it's not a new word, but it's a concept and an idea and an insight that has become much more widespread in research, but also in life in the last half decade, I would say. But still, I think a lot of people are not quite clear what it actually means. But also, I think as researchers, we're not actually really good at taking it properly into account and making it really inform our research. So that is what we're actually going to talk about in this session. And since we're late, I'm not going to introduce it anymore, but I will let Satang and Bane from the University of Pretoria via Seattle, now in Seattle, to give us a tour de force, a quick run through, and to introduce the panel. And then we have a great panel, and a big panel for a short session, but we have Jenna Kothari with us from Bangalore, who most of you would have heard already or some of you at least, giving a keynote on gender inequality and the law. She's an advocate before the Supreme Court of India, and also the executive director of the Center for Law and Policy Research, where they do a lot of work on intersectionalities between gender, race, caste and class in India. We will have with us Megan McCloskey, also from Seattle, who's doing a lot of work on disability with relation to intersectionality. And we have Liv Tønnesen from the Christian Michelsen Institute, and Camilisa Rosario, also from CMI and University of Bergen, with us here. So you'll hear from all of them in due time. I'm Siri Gloppen. I'm the head of Law Transform. So Satang, I'll throw the ball to you first. Intersectionality.
Hi Siri, hi everybody, and I'm so nostalgic. I have my CMI cupcake right here. Anyway,
Transformer. You're a
exactly.
Law Transformer. You've been here so many years.
Yeah. I'll try to be quick, given that we don't have a lot of time. And as you rightly said, considering the fact that the concept of intersectionality, or the framework of intersectionality, has been the talk of the town for quite a bit, and I'll just look at it briefly in terms of my own research that I was doing on the power dynamics in the provision of legal abortion in South Africa, specifically looking at how nurses understand and exercise conscientious objection. I think broadly when we, I'm not going to give a definition, but broadly when we talk about intersectionality, it's really based on this idea that social categorizations, such as whether they are race, class, gender, are very much connected in terms of how they overlap as sometimes as systems of discrimination, or rightly, as the blob said in the program, sometimes a system of disadvantage as well. And it has really, it has really proven necessary in terms of understanding the wide range of differences, whether it has to be on individual sexual orientation, whether it's age, whether it's disability or ability, and other issues. I think at the bottom line is that individuals, all of us, have individual identities that intersect in ways that impact how we are viewed, understood, and treated. So in terms of my own work, I'm still trying to understand the implication of intersectionality, especially for feminist research. But more specifically, I was interested in contributing towards the debate in terms of contributing towards the debate for African feminist discourse and theorization. So yes, we have this great concept, but how do we use it within the African context? What is the implication? What is the impact for us? And how do you really utilize it in such a way that it has a transnational salience? And really, I think for me, especially in terms of moving away just from, this whole criticism about universal theorizing, really attention is paid to intersectionality that really looks at different identities, whether, as I said earlier, whether it's race, class, whether it's gender, sexuality, and others that can actually interlock with systems of systems of oppression as well. I think this really gives us a tool in terms of an analytical tool in terms of, for me, especially in my own research, in terms of looking at the woman, not as a single entity, but as an individual that is made up of multiplicities and so forth. But I think also we need to be careful, especially in terms of listing identities. I think Kimberly Crenshaw was right when she cautioned us that when we're thinking about intersectionality, it is important that we do not just list identities, but there is really the need to understand the differences in various historical and social contexts. And I think for me, especially with the research that I was doing in South Africa, I think this was important in terms of how do we situate utilizing the theory of intersectionality within a context that pays attention to the historical and social context of that particular side or particular country that you're researching or topic. And as I said, in terms of trying to contribute towards the application and the meaning of the concept of intersectionality within the African context, I think it has really been argued that the African woman, for instance, should not be seen as a homogeneous group. And I think this is just even applicable just generally in terms of women generally, especially in terms of looking at other variables. We really talk about race, class, gender, and so forth, but other variables such as age is important, socioeconomic status, which might come into class, but even the rural-urban dichotomy, especially in terms of looking at what might be the variation between these two as well. And in terms of how I utilize it in my own practice, I think, I don't know, I'm sure quite a number of you have read Professor Ngwena's book, What is Africanness? And I think in that book, he actually argues that identities, for instance, should not be seen as unitary nature and self, but it should be seen as tethered. The identities to which intersectionalities are tethered, whether they're race, class, or sexuality, should be understood as like provisional attachments and not permanent attachments. So as I said, my research was focused on looking at the power dynamics in the provision of legal abortion. So for the study itself, I did in-depth interviews and focus group discussions with nurses in public and private facilities in Gauteng, which is an urban province, and in Limpopo, which are categorized as a mixed urban-rural province, which were used as the primary means for data collection. For me, the focus was to identify specific identities within the South African context that needed to be considered apart from race, class, and gender. As I said, the usual identities that we usually look at. So for me, I think one of the criticism of utilizing the concept of intersectionality either as an analytical tool or framework is regard to this idea that it doesn't really have a set of methodology. So in terms of trying to address this, I think I was also particularly cognizant of this idea that I can actually let intersectional categories emerge from the local context itself, that is from the data sites themselves, rather than, assume to know what matters by really interrogating the gaps and the silences in the data as well. So within the framework of the study itself, intersectionality was understood as more than an identity, that it really draws on the complex subjectivities and experiences of nurses in South Africa who are mostly women, and mostly the nurses that I interviewed were actually women, but who are nurses that either provide or do not provide abortion services, really. And I try to look at this from a simultaneous viewpoint of both privilege and oppression. I think this really echoes this idea that victims do not really, in most cases, do not have the exclusive access to truth about oppression. I'm just trying to look. So Siri, just wave if
you actually should. Yeah, you actually should wrap up now.
Okay. Okay.
You should wrap up.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I think in terms of wrapping up, I think the approach for me was, in terms of the applicability of intersectionality in the research, was not to say, for instance, race plus class plus gender, but it was like race times class times gender. And given that I was letting intersectional approaches or categories emerge from the local context itself, this also meant that what I realized is, or what came out of the the analysis is that, sometimes these categories, and depending on the data side, that ethnicity, for instance, and structural power based on culture can be more powerful than race, for instance, especially considering the South African context and so forth. And I believe probably in India it will be caste and religious affiliation, but Gina will really talk about that. So I think in general the framework was useful. It has its criticisms, it has its, as Siri said, its struggles, but I'm sure we'll talk more about that. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Satang. Very interesting, very useful. One of the people I know who've done a lot of research, explicitly sort of researching intersectionality, is Jana Kodri in Bangalore. So maybe you could talk to us, Jana, about some of the, see if you're still with us, about the work you're doing at the Center for Law and Policy Research. I don't know, maybe the system has kicked you.
Yeah, I can. Yeah. Can you hear me? Yeah. I mean, I can't put on my video for some reason, but if I can be heard, then
yes, you can.
Yes, you can. Okay, great. So I'll just speak then. So thank you again for including me in this panel, and Satang, that was great to hear from you. On intersectionality, I think what Satang shared about including it in our research, and it depends a lot on the context. And in the Indian context, our work around intersectionality, we've tried to look at the intersectionalities of gender, gender identity, looking at the transgender identity, looking at disability, and also looking at caste. And we've tried to look at some of these different identities and the intersections. And in the Indian context, intersectionality in research methodology and also in activism has been to some extent a fairly recent kind of development, though the idea of intersectionality is not a new idea, but I think both in research and activism and civil society work, it's been fairly recent. And some of the reasons are, I would argue that there have been traditional intersections that have been probed, but not some others. So, for example, the anti-caste movement in India has always examined caste and gender historically, and the rights of Dalit women, the oppression or the discrimination, aggravated discrimination faced by Dalit women has always been examined. So the caste and gender intersectionality is not new, but for example, disability and caste, these intersections have never been examined. And perhaps one of the reasons also is that the disability movement and the anti-caste movements have not collaborated very strongly historically, and so these intersections that we are researching are new intersections. There isn't much empirical data on it. There isn't much scholarly writing on it. So when we explore in our work looking at intersectionalities of caste and disability, these are very, very new fields of research that we're initiating. The third kind of combination is looking at gender identity in all these contexts, looking at gender identity and disability, gender identity and caste. And in the Indian context, these intersections become very important. So while the trans issue, transgender rights and trans activism is being articulated very strongly in the Indian context, what is interesting is that it's the trans Dalit activists who are raising the issue of aggravated discrimination that they face as trans activists who are also Dalit or scheduled caste and scheduled tribe, and how they are in many ways excluded from equal opportunities in public employment because of these intersections. So one of the big demands of the trans rights movement is to seek reservation in public employment. There already is reservation for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, and when the trans reservation is included, the government includes it as within an excluded or in backward class. So transgender persons who are both trans and scheduled caste have to choose an identity. And these, and these experiences are raising the need for a more intersectional approach, not only in research, but also in policy. And that is what we've been working on. Our initial work, before we took on, before we started our research, our initial effort was to really study the intersectional experience. And we started this last year. Actually, in 2018, we did a year-long study where we looked in the 4 states of South India, in the 4 southern states, we did both a qualitative and a quantitative study, where we interviewed around 25 different persons from different intersectionalities, looking at 25 qualitative interviews and about 150 survey respondents with whom we used a survey questionnaire, looking at issues of how housing, education, employment, access to legal services, access to police, healthcare, all these, how were their experiences in all these areas, and we studied these questions from different intersections of gender, gender identity, disability, and caste. And our report, which we produced at the end of 2018, which is available on our website, our report actually showed that the most aggravated forms of discrimination were faced by people at the intersections, whether it is in terms of education, whether it is in terms of sexual violence, the experience of sexual violence at workplaces, access to healthcare, housing, etc. And people at the intersections of gender identity, disability, caste faced the most aggravated forms of discrimination. And we use this study to initiate conversations of intersectionality amongst bureaucrats at the government level, to push policy to be more intersectional, and also with civil society activists. And I would just like to kind of conclude by saying that now, presently, in this time of COVID, where in India especially, we're still under lockdown in many ways, and the lockdown saw the most glaring deprivations of food, access to livelihood, shelter, and we found that again the intersectional experience showed that it was not only trans persons, but there were people with trans persons with disabilities, people with disabilities who were Dalit, who were the most excluded from any relief measures, from any government benefits, or any other welfare measures. And I think the COVID pandemic and the kind of experience of people showed that we needed strongly an intersectional approach even at the policy level. So that's, yeah, I wanted to share that. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, ma'am. I'm getting feedback from it's mine, but this is okay. So hopefully this works. I'm trying to follow the questions on the online as well, but you'll just have to help me. So this was excellent, excellent, Jenna. And I think that you're really showing that it's not only about people who are in the intersections between different dynamics of marginalization who are sort of worse off, for instance, in the COVID crisis, but it's also dynamics of invisibility, making what is happening in the intersections much more invisible from the point of view of those who are activists, who are engaging. I want to, now you've heard, and also Megan McCloskey is following us from Seattle. I have now heard what Satang has been saying and what Jenna has been saying, and you have your own research experiences. And I want to hear your reflections on what we've heard now and how it resonates with what you've been doing as well. And I would like to ask maybe, because there is another related issue, which is when you are not positioned in the intersections that you are investigating. It's not only about how do we approach this in research, but when you are in a very different place, how does that impact on your ability to actually come into, to actually sort of really approach what is happening in these intersecting dynamics of exclusion as we're seeing now. So Megan, would you like to start? Your work is particularly on disability.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Siri. And thanks for taking on this topic, actually, because I think it's really interesting and so key, particularly for policy development, which is the space where I tend to be working more. But so I think you're making a really important point there, Siri. I'm just going to follow up because I think there's two ways of thinking about methods when we think about intersectionality. There's the, how are you attentive to different forms of marginalization, different forms of diversity in the course of your research? How are you able to, how do we recognize, for example, whose voices are not at the table, right? Who are we not hearing from? What cases are not being brought? And so when we make these kind of broader conclusions about, access to courts or access to political participation, are we thoughtful about ways in which that's not equal for all? I mean, even, if we say, this matters, it doesn't matter equally the same way for everyone. And if not, why not? But then there's also the piece of in terms of the process. How is the process of doing research, how can that be more diversified, more intersectional? And there's a really nice resource that I'll put in the chat. Chicago Beyond is an organization, nonprofit organization that works on, or produced a guidebook on how to embed racial justice or how to avoid racial injustice during the research process. And it proposes a number of different questions that I think are really important to think about in any context and help us kind of excavate some of the intersectional issues. And some of the questions concern, how do you design your research? I mean, what kind of topics are you choosing? Are they topics that matter to the community that you are interested in? Or are they having input into how the research is going to be designed, what is going to be covered, or are you doing something just because it's interesting to you? And I think about this often because I do disability work, and I do not identify as disabled. And so I'm very conscious of my own role, kind of intervening in a space where I'm not always sure that I'm really the right person. I don't know whether I really belong in that space. And so making sure that I'm reflecting the priorities of the people that I'm talking to, I think is really important in the way in which the research is even being constructed, it's being designed, and the way I'm thinking about it. I also think it's important to think about how, sort of how you're formulating your questions and who's involved in that formulation and who are you asking them of. So, for example, am I always asking people with disabilities or disabled people's organizations, to speak to and exclusively about disabled rights? Or am I asking them to talk to me about political participation? You have an opinion about foreign affairs or other things that are relevant to all people. You know, can we ask women about something other than violence against women, for example? I mean, right? Like, how are we sort of, you know, how do we avoid our own sort of embedded biases in the way that we're asking questions and sort of the way that we're designing the research? Also think about transparency, because one of the ways that I try to resolve being an outsider research is by working with, and as often as I can, working in teams that involve people with disabilities. So on campus, we have it's not really a center, but we're part of the International Policy Institute. We've started a Disability Inclusive Development Initiative. And that is a space for graduate and undergraduate students to work on applied research projects. And we prioritize students with disabilities. So we have about 50% of the students involved in that project are students with disabilities. And so they're part of the research teams, which I think is really important to think about. Not always just sort of dropping in as kind of the, you know, from a helicopter and sort of saying, okay, I'm going to look at this and then leave and have my own analysis. But rather, how do you include the sort of the interest groups as part of the research, you know, as part of the research team, as analysts, and not as token participants, but as real researchers who are having a substantive role and substantive input in the conclusions and the recommendations. I also think it's really important to think about kind of the biases that are built into sort of the way that we think about what counts as evidence, right? I mean, you know, you think about evidence-based analysis or evidence-based policy development, and what are the gold standards? I mean, it depends on your field, but, you know, oftentimes we think about like randomized control trials, or, you know, the WHO will have very limited things that they would consider evidence, and yet how often that, you know, that sort of, that acts to exclude different voices who are generating really important information, who have important knowledges, but may or may not transmit them in the same way. And so can you be, in the research design, can you be inclusive of different forms of knowledge, and in that way, you know, be more inclusive in the research process. And, you know, I also think that understanding the value, kind of explaining who, you know, or at least reflecting on what the value relationships. I mean, this is to Satang's point about power dynamics within the research. So who's benefiting from this research project, and how, and being transparent within, whether it's within your research team or among the people that you're working with. You know, I think it's important to be clear about that, and how, you know, authorship is going to be acknowledged or reflected in terms of, you know, any given paper, and allowing us to be inclusive about in those spaces as well. So those are just some thoughts.
Yeah, thanks a lot. That was really interesting. So thanks a lot for sharing that. And I know it's early. Thank you for getting up in the morning so early, both to you and Satang, and for joining us. I want to turn to you as well. So Kamalisa, I mean, you're at some intersections more than me here while I'm here in Bergen as a researcher as well. What are your thoughts on this?
Yes, thank you, Siri. I have many thoughts, and I think all interventions have been fantastic and have touched upon very important issues. One I think is, of course, we're talking about intersection, but at the basis of intersection is feminist theory and activism. These two aspects are very important, and of course feminism is about activism. And then the work that we have been doing, for example, with our project in sexual and reproductive health, has been also on LGBT rights, and this is more or less what I wanted to focus on, the intersectional gender identity and also sexual sex orientation. Sorry. And in particular, we have done now recently 2 surveys, one before COVID and one now on COVID with LGBT people and about their experiences in Mozambique. In particular, lesbian women have been sort of these lost people in the survey. We haven't been able to interact as much and hear from them. And we are extremely curious about their experiences and how the intersection of being a woman, and there is so much about gender disadvantage and discrimination in general. But then there comes this other category, which is sexual orientation, that adds on to the violence that these women suffer, that we have been hearing about in the few studies that have been there, with the few women we have been able to talk to, that really touch upon the issues of feminism and activism, that although there is a theory, there is the activism trying to cater for the rights of women, they haven't been able to do it at the same extent to lesbian women. They are kind of lost as women when they actually have particular disadvantages or discrimination because of their sexual orientation. Increased violence towards them at the home front, and of course generally it's either forced marriages or corrective rape, which is usually common, but also being denied education, furthering their disadvantage, because as women, depending of course whether they are from cities, the well-off families, they could have had the opportunity to study further. And here I wanted to go into Satang. She talked about a system of disadvantage, and I wanted to reverse this and talk about missed opportunities or withdrawn opportunities that certain women can face because of their sexual orientation. Increased violence because of sexual orientation. So there are certain aspects that if we either look at them as women generally, we can miss out because we're not understanding where other aspects of their life, in this case sexual orientation, might come into play. In terms of activism, there is one study that has been conducted in Mozambique, only one, specifically on lesbians. And it was very interesting reading about it, which is, since we have these 2 approaches, the rights approach, which is usually feminist activists have used to engage towards women's rights. The rights approach has been used for women, whereas for LGBT people, it has been the health approach. Mm-hmm. And this has advantage gay men, at sometimes trans women up to a certain point, but not women, lesbian women, and not trans men. And so this author, Maria Judith Ngale, she talks about how, this health language, this activism towards LGBT renders invisible lesbian and bisexual women by not approaching towards what both Satang and Jaina talked about, which is these cultural practices and cultural and social practices that actually can have a stronger impact on what happens.
Thanks a lot. Yeah. Very interesting. Liv.
Yes.
How does this all look from your perspective of doing work in Sudan?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the interventions so far speak to me. I really agree with Satang about this sort of it's very important not to look at intersectionality as sort of a checklist that you have to go through when you go to the field. As any work that I do, I use more of like qualitative and like grounded theory approach. So for me, it's very important in studying any issue that you go to the field, not only with an open mind, but not with this sort of prefixed categories or a checklist that, you know, I'm looking at race, class, gender, and let sort of the people that you meet and you talk to lead you in the direction of understanding not only how these different social and political and religious identities and categories intersect to produce disadvantage, but also how they intersect to produce privilege. So a lot of my research has been on and women's movements in Sudan, and they are in a position of being sort of educated, urban based, from certain ethnic groups, certain race, certain religion, that all together produce a certain type of privilege. And they, of course, are stating to represent Sudanese women, but are they really? So a lot of my work has been a sort of critical engagement with the women's movement in Sudan. And also in a way then it's very important to situate, you know, their work and in sort of a historical political context. So what rights are they pushing for? Who would benefit from them? So now that the new transitional government in Sudan, you know, they're celebrated for allowing women or reversing a law saying that women cannot travel abroad if they don't, with their children, if they don't have the male guardian's permission, that this has been revoked. That is a big thing. But how many Sudanese women are privileged to travel abroad? What they really need to revoke is the whole idea of male guardianship. So, I mean, I think it's important to ground it in a sort of political historical context, and also I really sort of agree with Megan in sort of doing research together with, and I also do some research together with Sudanese researcher and also women's rights activists, and how that sort of collaboration also brings forth some productive tension, both in grounding me about, you know, is this research really useful for those that you are studying, and for me to also pose some critical questions about how the women's movement is operating, how inclusive it is, and how representative it is. So,
thanks a lot, Liv. That is really an interesting reflections and perspective. I think we actually can take, if there are a couple of questions, and then we'll give 1 minute to each of the panelists to wrap up. And is there any? I couldn't see if there is any questions on the chat. Okay, you have to read it out to me. I mean, I'm old. I can't do this. Okay, so I have to go down here. I'm sorry. So Ted is asking, as legal and social scientists, what do you see as the most effective tool for intersectional engagement? Naturally, theoretical political analysis is central, but more specifically, do you advise institutional ethnography, drafting policy and various other legal documents, legal reform, etc.? What specific methods, more than its fundamental ethical implications? Not to mention what kind of technologies are used within the research. To what are you referring to Megan? It would be great if you shared those share the resources that you've been mentioning. Maybe in the event discussion on Facebook or in comments. Yes. So this was a big question about how do we do it? What should we prioritize? And so on. So it's actually really good for the one minute sum up. Satag, 1 minute from you first.
Okay. As you said, I think it's broad, but I think in terms of what methods are more useful, I think it just goes back to what we talked about in terms of context and what the goal of whether the research or the activism and the engagement is focused on. I mean, in different situations, it can be legal reform, as others said, it can be about policy engagement, and in addition to adding to the theoretical debate and so forth. So I think it depends on the context and the issue that you're looking at. But I think at the end of the day, whatever method is used, I think it is important that we're able to, as everybody said, take a nuanced approach in terms of trying to understand the complex spaces that people live in, that they can, still occupy a space for both, privilege as well as possibly being oppressed, as evident in my own research. And I think for me, I will conclude with saying that I think Audre Lorde said it best when she said there is no single issue struggle, because people don't live single issue lives. And I think perhaps this is something that we might, keep in mind when we do research or activism and engagement in terms of having an intersectional underlined in behind our goals and aims. Thank you.
Thank you, Satang. Jenna.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a big question and a great way to kind of take final comments. I think the intersectional approach in research has been kind of well practiced or documented, but I think in other areas the intersectional approach is fairly new, and so I would in fact say that we need to push it in activism, in policy work, and in law reform. I find that in the Indian context, in all these three areas, the intersectional approach is greatly lacking. One is activism. We have to forge kind of new bonds in civil society groups across different groups, which are not traditionally kind of the traditional gender intersection is always there, but not the new kind of intersection. So we need to push that. Policy has to have an intersectional approach throughout, which we find lacking. And some of the gains we've been making in India is really pushing an intersectional approach in law reform. And one of our efforts has been to work on, our conversations on a draft equality law or an anti-discrimination law is to bring a strong intersectional approach in those conversations. In India, we don't have an anti-discrimination legislation, and we are arguing for it, but we're trying to push for a law that has an intersectional approach. So I think all these three areas are really, really key areas for work on intersectionality. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Jenna. Megan.
So I think, yeah, 1 minute. Okay. So I think the thing that I look for in policy-related work is data and accountability, those two things. Because on the data point, to thinking about, we treasure what we measure, right? And so you will find lots of policies, you will find lots of really good laws that say, we're adopting an intersectional approach, we're, anti-discrimination is animating everything we do. But when you actually look at the way that organizations are collecting data and what they care about, it's not there. So they're not measuring, they're not actually seeing whether anybody with a disability is attending this particular seminar, or anyone is benefiting from this program or funding or whatever. And that then feeds into accountability. What we've seen, I worked on a project looking at UN entities and how they are adapting disability inclusion. And one of the main things that employees said was that we're not accountable for it. Nobody's, we don't have to report on it. And so we don't worry about it unless somebody cares personally, because nobody's asking us about what we're doing on disability inclusion. We've got a lot of other things that we are prioritizing. And so I think kind of going beyond what the law says or what policies look like, really looking at how, hard at what data is being collected and who is accountable for that, or how that feeds into accountability, is key for actually seeing whether intersectionality means anything.
Thanks, Megan. Very good, very concrete advice. Carmelisa.
Yes. So I think what I would have to say in my last minute would be that this renewed talk and this insistence in intersectionality is actually a part of maturing. We did have the need of a unified approach because we needed strength in numbers. We needed to recognize the gender, for example, was important. And now the ability to see diversity within and to conduct the discussion within it means maturity, and it means that we're progressing, which I think is very positive. Now, I think that we need to be careful with when we're thinking about intersection, not coming up with tokenism of inclusion. When we're saying, make sure that we have women, make sure that we have disabled women, make sure that we have LGBT women, etc., that we're really, really looking into what are the implications of these diverse cumulative experiences bringing to these women. And I think this would be what I wanted to live as a reflection of intersectionality in our work.
Very good. Liv, you get the last word.
Oh, wow. Thank you so much. What do I want to say in 1 minute? I think if you're going to do a research with sort of intersectionality at its core, for me, I think you need to start with sort of women's lived experiences. And that's your starting point, and you have to move from there, because then you can avoid this sort of tokenism or checklist or I find that some sort of research on intersectionality has become this like checklist, which I think sort of depoliticized a very potentially political and radical concept that we should engage with and use more. So I think starting with the lived experience of real people in the real world would be a good start.
As long as you don't care for who's lived experience.
Yeah.
Could I just start one thing? There was a question about ethnography. As an anthropologist, I'm always for ethnography. So,
yeah.
So anthropologists got the last.
Yeah.
In a panel with actually 3 lawyers and a political scientist and an anthropologist. They're good, well done. 2 political scientists. Thank you very much.